The Cold War was a conflict of missiles and ideologies, but for the average American family in the 1950s, it was a war fought mostly in the basement. It was a war defined by the relentless, terrifying realization that the enemy possessed the power to reach out and touch you, wherever you were, at any moment. This fear was not vague. It was focused, intense, and utterly personalized by the symbol of the mushroom cloud. The promise of the post-war American dream, suburban bliss, 2 cars and a house filled with new appliances, was constantly undermined by this single, simple reality. Total nuclear annihilation was one button push away. How did a society reconcile the great dream of prosperity with the terror of oblivion? The answer came from the government and a nascent, aggressive industry, civil defense. Their solution was the bomb shelter. This wasn't just a political talking point. It was an ambitious, multi-million-dollar psychological project designed to convince the American public that nuclear war was survivable, if only they prepared diligently, purchased the right supplies, and, ideally, built a concrete bunker in the backyard. This was the era of the most famous and, arguably, most ironic propaganda campaign in U.S. history, Duck and Cover. Children in schools across the country practiced diving under wooden desks, taught that this simple maneuver could save them from the flash and fire of a thermal blast that could melt steel miles away. To a generation raised on films and cartoons of friendly defense planners, the advice was comforting. To a physicist, it was absurd. The nuclear dream, therefore, was a double-edged sword. On one side was the absolute faith in American technology that could build the bomb. On the other, the desperate, almost pathetic hope that American ingenuity could also shield the family from the bomb. This hope fueled a strange, brief, but deeply resonant domestic industry, the fallout shelter craze. The government's promotion of personal survival wasn't just about calming the public, it was a psychological shield for national policy. If Americans believed they could survive a first strike, they would be more willing to support the expensive, aggressive foreign policy of nuclear deterrence or mutually assured destruction, MAD. The civil defense planners were not selling survival, they were selling justification for the arms race itself. The official U.S. government policy toward nuclear war was defined by the Federal Civil Defense Administration, FCDA, established in 1951. Its primary mission was twofold: to provide a credible plan for survival and to manage the public's overwhelming anxiety. The FCDA, however, operated with a massive and intentional disconnect between the existential threat and the resources allocated to counter it. While the military budget swelled with billions for bombers and missiles, the FCDA itself received a pittance, forcing them to rely almost entirely on public persuasion and cheap DIY solutions. The FCDA's public messaging was a masterful blend of civic duty and carefully controlled realism. They did not deny the destructive power of the atomic bomb, but rather broke it down into 4 manageable threats: the flash, the blast, the fire, and the fallout. Of these, the FCDA heavily stressed that fallout, the invisible, radioactive dust that could drift hundreds of miles, was the survivable threat, provided you had a shield and supplies. This strategic focus minimized the terrifying reality of the direct blast effect, which was widely known to be unsurvivable. This focus led to the creation of the minimum survival kit, a simple, deeply American concept of personal preparedness. Every family was urged to keep a stock of canned food, bottled water, a battery-powered radio, a first aid kit, and a Geiger counter, if they could afford one, near their designated shelter area. This area was usually a basement, a central hallway, or a designated lean-to and a garage, any structure that offered 2 feet of solid material between the family and the outside world. This official guidance immediately sparked a bizarre and highly profitable new domestic economy, the shelter industry. Entrepreneurs and defense contractors, many of whom had no background in construction or radiation shielding, began flooding the market with ready-made solutions. You could buy everything from small prefabricated steel cylinders designed to be buried vertically in your lawn, to massive multi-room concrete bunkers equipped with air filtration systems and plumbing. For a few $1,000s, a huge and anxious sum in the 1950s, you could buy the illusion of safety. The marketing was aggressive and targeted the core American value of self-reliance and the pervasive social anxiety. Advertisements in magazines showed smiling families happily stocked in their bunkers, treating the shelter as just another modern convenience, like a refrigerator or a television set. This approach effectively privatized civil defense, shifting the enormous psychological and financial burden of survival from the government to the individual homeowner. If you died in a nuclear attack, the subtext suggested, it was not the government's fault for failing to deter the bomb, but your own for failing to prepare and purchase properly. The pressure on the American homeowner to provide a shelter for their family quickly became immense, turning a matter of national security into an anxious matter of keeping up with the Joneses. The ultimate absurdity of the shelter craze was the profound chasm between the managed threat and the proposed defense. While the FCDA assured the public that a family shelter could withstand the fallout, the reality of the thermonuclear era, ushered in by the Soviet Union's successful test of a hydrogen bomb in 1953, meant that these suburban bunkers offered almost no protection against a direct hit. A single Soviet megaton bomb detonated over a major city would generate a thermal flash capable of causing third-degree burns up to 20 miles away, followed by a blast wave that would flatten wooden suburban homes for miles around. Yet, the FCDA's public service announcements, often delivered with cheerful, upbeat music and friendly cartoon characters like Bert the Turtle, of Duck and Cover fame, consistently minimized the blast and fire in favor of the manageable threat of radioactive dust. This strategic downplaying was a necessary psychological tool of government policy. Admitting the true, unmitigated destructive power of thermonuclear weapons would have crippled the nation with panic and likely led to demands for immediate unilateral disarmament. Instead, the government effectively engaged in a massive campaign to replace paralyzing, existential dread with productive anxiety. By giving people a simple, achievable task, build a shelter, stock the cans, they maintained national sanity and public support for the expensive arms race. The shelter industry quickly became a wild west of dubious contractors and aggressive salesmanship. Basement builders offered quick, cheap solutions, often simply lining a corner of a basement with concrete blocks and a steel door, promising safety without any actual scientific verification of adequate shielding. Salesmen promised that buying a shelter was not just preparedness, but an investment. It increased the resale value of your suburban home, often claiming it was the ultimate status symbol. This economic angle placed enormous social and moral pressure on the homeowner. Not having a shelter was seen as not only personally irresponsible, but bordering on unpatriotic, leaving your family vulnerable to communism's invisible agent, radioactive fallout. The financial cost, however, was significant. A prefabricated steel shelter could cost between $1,500 and $5,000, a massive portion of a middle-class family's annual income. This highly visible, anxious financial decision became a necessary expression of Cold War duty. The demand for shelters was so immediate and overwhelming that it led the federal government to draft official, public model shelter plans. In 1958, the FCDA released official designs for easy-to-build, inexpensive shelters that could be added to an existing home or dug directly into the backyard. These plans were often rudimentary, requiring only common tools and materials, but their true function was to legitimize the entire endeavor. They gave the public official sanction and proof that, yes, nuclear war was a personal construction project you could reasonably expect to finish on the weekend. This period saw a strange national obsession with canned goods and supplies. Families were taught to meticulously rotate their stock of canned peaches, evaporated milk, and Spam, creating a pantry of fear that symbolized their readiness. The contents of the family shelter became a highly specific, anxious expression of the consumer culture itself, blending the material comforts of modern life with existential dread and the promise of a controlled, if temporary, subterranean isolation. The shelter debate, however, was not monolithic. It quickly became a source of deep moral and philosophical division within American communities. This division centered on the ethical question of exclusivity and neighborly conduct. If a nuclear attack occurred, and only your family had invested the time and money to build a concrete bunker, what obligation did you have to your neighbors who had not? The controversy, known in many communities as the shelter ethic, raged in magazines, churches, and neighborhood associations. Sermons were delivered debating the Christian duty to share resources during a cataclysm. Articles asked pointed questions. Should a man shoot his neighbor to protect his family's food supply? The consensus, often unstated, was that a homeowner's first duty was to his own kin, leading to a grim, tacit acceptance of lethal selfishness in the event of an attack. This ethical dilemma accelerated the arms race narrative on the home front. The decision to build a shelter became less about survival and more about insurance against society's breakdown. It was a bet that the community would devolve into chaos, and the concrete walls were there to protect the family not just from radiation, but from desperate fellow citizens. The government, particularly under President Eisenhower, tried to sidestep the moral controversy by focusing on community shelters, but the federal bureaucracy was slow-moving and vastly underfunded for a project of that scope. The Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization, OCDM, which replaced the FCDA in 1958, did eventually launch a program to identify and stock public shelters, usually basements of schools, churches, and municipal buildings. But this centralized effort never captured the anxious, immediate energy of the individual homeowner movement. For the American media, the shelter controversy was pure dramatic gold. Life magazine, Collier's, and countless newspapers ran detailed, often sensationalized, photo essays contrasting the elaborate private bunkers of the wealthy with the meager preparations of the average citizen. This served only to increase the social pressure, making the anxiety a constant, unavoidable fixture of suburban life. The fear was further intensified by the development of sophisticated testing in the Nevada desert. Each successful detonation of a U.S. nuclear device provided new, terrifying data on the true reach of fallout, which the government then struggled to communicate in calming terms. The public knew the danger was real and growing, even if the government offered only minimal, feel-good solutions. The gap between scientific reality and public reassurance was the true danger zone of the Cold War's domestic front. The shelter industry, sensing the government's desperate need to legitimize its survival messaging, began selling high-tech accessories that further separated the wealthy from the rest of the community. These accessories went beyond basic shielding, promising subterranean comfort. Contractors offered custom-built air filtration systems designed to screen out radioactive particles, specialized moisture-proof storage containers, and even pre-packaged entertainment systems for the 2 weeks of isolation mandated for the worst fallout period. These luxury shelters often included chemical toilets, large water tanks, and even exercise equipment, marketing the bunker as a temporary, if slightly cramped, second home. The architectural impact was significant. New suburban home designs sometimes incorporated a shelter room directly into the basement plans, marking the threat as a permanent fixture of modern living. Builders used thick concrete slabs, steel reinforcement, and earth berms, mounds of dirt piled against the walls, to increase the structural integrity and shielding capacity. The bomb shelter was no longer an afterthought. It was part of the American dream's blueprint. The irony was that this elaborate, expensive, and customized shelter construction often resulted in nothing more than a false sense of security. As weapons technology advanced, the Soviet Union's successful 1961 test of the Tsar Bomba, the most powerful weapon ever detonated, proved that a single blast could utterly destroy an area the size of a state. The utility of the average backyard shelter dropped to near zero. A structure designed to survive fallout would be useless against a direct ICBM hit, or even a near miss. Yet, the industry survived on the hope, the fear, and the government's implicit endorsement. The government continued to issue public service announcements showing citizens how to seal their basements with household supplies and plastic sheeting, desperate to maintain the illusion that preparedness was the key to victory. The most important yield of the civil defense program was not a decrease in casualties, but the stabilization of the domestic population, allowing the military-industrial complex to continue the arms race unchallenged by mass panic. This public cooperation was essential for the policy of massive retaliation, the core of Eisenhower's defense strategy, which threatened overwhelming nuclear force against any Soviet aggression. If the home front panicked, the strategy would crumble. The backyard bunker was, therefore, not a military asset, but a political one. The ultimate failure of the individual shelter program was highlighted by the profound lack of centralized infrastructure. The nation had invested enormous private capital in backyard bunkers, but there were no organized plans for mass evacuation, no coordination of water and food supply beyond the personal kit, and no centralized medical response. This systemic failure was publicly acknowledged by President Kennedy in 1961, who inherited the disastrously fragmented system. Kennedy attempted to nationalize the effort, launching a massive federal program to build community shelters capable of housing millions. His administration planned to stock these public shelters with supplies and mark the locations with the distinctive civil defense logo. This shift from individual responsibility to federal infrastructure was a tacit admission that the FCDA's decade-long DIY approach had failed to provide real security. Kennedy's push for community shelters, however, sparked immediate controversy. Critics, particularly in the media, attacked the program as a waste of taxpayer money and a form of nuclear fatalism, arguing that it encouraged the public to accept nuclear war as inevitable. The program faced immediate resistance from local communities, who often refused to allow their schools or churches to be designated as fallout shelters, citing liability or moral objections to housing armed, possibly panicked crowds. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 briefly silenced all critics. For 13 terrifying days, the nuclear threat became not theoretical, but immediate and imminent. Public anxiety peaked, and the demand for any kind of information or protection became overwhelming. People rushed to stock supplies, and communities scrambled to clear out designated shelter spaces. This crisis briefly gave the civil defense movement the credibility it had always lacked, serving as a brutal, real-world proof of concept for the FCDA's warnings. However, once the crisis passed, the public lost interest just as quickly as it had panicked. The community shelter program, already hampered by bureaucracy and local resistance, lost its urgency. The federal government, unable to sustain the political will or the necessary funding, eventually allowed the vast majority of the community shelter sites to fall into disrepair, with food and medical kits expiring in dusty basements across the country. The final architectural yield of this era, however, remains visible. Every new suburban school built in the 1950s and 1960s was designed with extra-thick concrete walls, minimal windows, and large windowless basements, architectural features mandated by the civil defense requirements. These schools, built to survive the blast and shield against fallout, are a lasting, tangible monument to the nuclear fear that defined a generation. The psychological aftermath of the shelter craze was profound, leaving a legacy of skepticism and dark humor regarding government competence. The public realized that the advice they had been given, ducking under a school desk or stocking up on canned goods in a plywood lean-to, was woefully inadequate against the awesome power of the hydrogen bomb. This realization led to a cultural shift away from preparedness and toward protest. By the mid-1960s, the failure of the civil defense effort contributed to the rise of the anti-nuclear movement. The focus shifted from personal survival to collective political action, demanding disarmament rather than DIY bunkers. The absurdity of the bomb shelter became a potent symbol used by protesters to highlight the madness of the arms race itself. The satire of the era. Most famously, Stanley Kubrick's 1964 film Drive, Strange Love, savagely mocked the notion that nuclear war was manageable, portraying civil defense planning and shelters as the delusional fantasies of a dangerously unstable military-industrial establishment. The bomb shelter, once a symbol of patriotic duty, became a cultural shorthand for 1950s naivete, though the final economic yield of the shelter craze was equally stark. The thousands of private companies that had sprung up to sell steel bunkers, Geiger counters, and air filtration systems quickly went bankrupt or pivoted to other products. The market for fear proved volatile and unsustainable once the immediate sense of crisis passed. The money invested by anxious homeowners in their private bunkers, often their life savings, became a wasted expenditure, a concrete testament to a fleeting, desperate delusion of control. This entire chapter of American history, the suburban bunker, the smiling salesman, the nervous rotation of canned peaches, is a vivid demonstration of how the existential threat of the Cold War was internalized and commercialized. The government, unable to solve the problem of nuclear weapons, chose instead to sell the psychology of survivability, turning the homeowner into a soldier on the domestic front. The ultimate yield of the civil defense effort was not physical security, but a powerful, if temporary, stabilization of the domestic psyche. By giving people a simple, tangible task, build, buy, and stock, the government successfully channeled mass existential terror into manageable, productive consumer anxiety. This manufactured sense of control allowed the nation to maintain its economic boom and political equilibrium, while the true, terrifying confrontation continued at the highest levels of government. The civil defense program, therefore, stands as one of the most effective, if ethically dubious, psychological operations of the Cold War. It convinced a generation that nuclear war was a hazard, not a finality, provided they maintained their faith in ingenuity and personal preparation. The suburban bomb shelter, whether a deluxe underground room or just a plywood lean-to, remains the ultimate architectural paradox of the 1950s, a bunker built to protect the American dream from extinction, but which ultimately served only to justify the continued production of the very weapons that threatened to destroy it. This strange era, where every home was a potential fortress and every backyard a construction site, is a vivid reminder that the innovations and anxieties of yesterday's yield continue to shape our modern world, leaving behind permanent, concrete scars on the landscape of American culture. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of history. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Yesterday's Yield for more untold stories of the Cold War, and let us know in the comments below. If you lived in the 1950s, would you have built a shelter, or would you have relied on duck and cover?